All right, welcome back. We're doing another video on 10th edition core rulebook. So we're going to start by going over rerolls and modifiers, and then we're going to go over reserves and strategic reserves. And that's going to be the bulk of this one. So as a kind of cleanup thing, because not much has changed here, they have clarified when it comes to rerolls, whether by stratagem or special ability. Obviously, you can't reroll a reroll, but they also clarified when you are rerolling a combined result. So if you've got 2d6 shots, or let's say 3d6 number of attacks, things like that, if you were to reroll that result, you're going to reroll all of the dice, not part of the dice. So unless there could be a special rule like we had with Here We Go, to where it specifically calls out rerolling one of the charge roll dice, unless it's specifically called out, you must reroll all parts of that result. When it comes to modifiers, they have said that there's a generic rule that basically says other than AP, there should be a maximum modifier of +1 and -1 to most rolls. That being said, it isn't super clear, but I'm interpreting the way they worded it as this is a final result to modifiers. So you can have multiple modifiers, but at the end, after you've applied them all, it caps itself. So you could have, a -1 to hit, and something else gives it +2 to hit. And then another thing gives it another +1 to hit. That probably won't happen, but if that weird scenario happens with stratagems and special rules, it would still be capped at +1, regardless of the fact that there was all these different stacking things. Okay, moving on to our reserves and strategic reserves. So this is one that's going to get a little confusing at first. When you read through the core rule book, you're going to see reserves is kind of a quick little half page that just says generic rules that apply to all reserves, like the fact that if reserves are still in reserves at the end of turn 5, they count as destroyed. So you can't just leave something in there forever and say your warlord is safe, that sort of thing. However, what's the most important thing here is when you go to the strategic reserve page, it has a really important line that clarifies a lot for us. And that is, quote, all strategic reserves are also reserve units. The reverse is not true. So what this means is anytime it talks about strategic reserves and restrictions on those strategic reserves, they don't apply to regular reserve units. However, if there's a restriction on reserve units, they will apply to both reserve units and strategic reserves. This is going to be a really big deal. So getting into it, all reserve units, again, they can arrive at the end of the movement phase. It is still in the movement phase, but it has its own little reserve step. Anything that arrives from reserves for any reason, again, regular reserves or strategic, counts as having made a normal move unless otherwise stated, which means it cannot move again after that. Things like the deep strike distance, the safety distance, however you want to call that, is specifically measured horizontally and does not count the verticalness of that 9-inch bubble. And then all units that are still in reserve, as we said at the end of turn 5, will count as destroyed. Now, that's for all reserves, including strategic reserves. Now, for strategic reserves, there's a whole bunch of information. It's an entire page worth of stuff. There's a chart that tells you, depending on how big of a game you're playing, how many points is allowed to be in reserve or strategic reserves, which is about a quarter of your list at any given time. And there's some other restrictions, like strategic reserves specifically can't arrive on turn 1. They call out turn 2, then turn 3 and on, which clarifies from that first sentence about strategic reserves. That means regular reserves can arrive on turn 1. So if you have a unit in regular reserves with deep strike, it can arrive right away. Strategic reserves that have to walk on the field or doing the outflank sort of thing, those aren't going to be able to arrive on turn. As we said, there's a maximum point depending on battle size. And then with strategic reserves, They specifically call out that they have to be wholly within 6 inches of a table edge, and outside 9 inches of an enemy. If it's on turn 2, you cannot use your opponent's deployment edge, but from turn 3 on, as long as you're still outside that 9 inches and wholly within 6, you can use any table. That we're fairly used to, but that differentiation between regular reserves and strategic reserves is really big as you go to read through this book. Um, there's a lot to do with this, but for the most part, strategic reserves are what we remember. Regular reserves are kind of bonus flexibility that we're getting because they don't count as strategic reserves. So it's way less restrictions and that we have to deal with for our deep strikers and flyers and things like that.
Yeah, I'm really curious how many turn 1 charges are going to get set up off of regular reserves based on this.
Yep, and we'll talk about that as we get into my weird ideas or weird rules video that we do later on. But in theory, you can have a whole lot. And while it seems really scary and like a lot of pressure, I think because everyone has access to it, we're going to see people kind of start to play around that and plan for that. Because the way deployment works, you really have to telegraph that before anyone deploys anything. You have to tell your opponent, what's going into deep strike reserves and what's going into strategic reserves. So they're going to have a lot of information when they're deploying. So we're going to see some, even if there's a hard learning curve and we all kind of have to get through that, eventually we're all going to get to a place to where we have some tactics and strategies to deal with that turn 1 pressure that is possible.
Yeah, alright. Anything else on this one for now?
Nope, I think we're good. We're going to keep trucking along with more videos and stay tuned for the next one.